A lone single father walks into a corrupt police station with a simple complaint. The sergeant on duty doesn't just reject it, he tears the paper to shreds, drops a pair of handcuffs on the desk, and tells him to leave. He thinks he's just bullied another nobody. But he has no idea that the man standing in front of him is a high-ranking official on a secret mission. By the end of this morning, the entire station will be forced to stand at attention and salute the man they just tried to throw out. And the secret they're hiding in the basement? It's about to destroy everything they built. The morning shift at the North River Police District began the way it always did. A cheap clock ticking against a yellowed wall, the smell of cold, burnt coffee that had been sitting in the pot since dawn, and a public counter that most officers treated more like an annoyance than a public duty. The lobby floor smelled heavily of cheap chemical cleaner and old yellowed paper. 2 rows of hard plastic chairs faced a wall of framed commendations and department awards, most of them at least a decade out of date, gathering dust under flickering fluorescent lights. It was 9:07, and when the heavy glass front doors swung open, and a man walked in. His name was Adrian Carter. To anyone sitting in that lobby, he looked like an ordinary, struggling citizen who had taken a day off work to handle something deeply unpleasant. He wore a gray cotton jacket that had completely lost its shape at the elbows, a pair of dark, unpressed pants, and worn-out leather shoes that had clearly been resoled and resoled more than once. No expensive car waited for him in the parking lot outside. No gold badge sat proudly on his chest. He carried nothing except a slim, black document case tucked firmly under his right arm. No one watched him cross the lobby. No one looked up from their phones or their paperwork. In a place like North River, ordinary people carrying ordinary folders were just background noise people to be dismissed, delayed, or ignored, and that was precisely what Adrian wanted. He hadn't brought a recording device. That was a calculated decision he had made out in his car, sitting in the quiet shadows of the parking lot, a choice he knew he would be forced to defend over the next 4 months of his life. If he wanted to see how an ordinary, defenseless citizen was treated when nothing was being officially recorded, he had to be that citizen. No safety net, no immediate backup. Just a man with a folder and a quiet determination. Inside that slim case was a single, signed complaint. It belonged to Evelyn Shaw, a frail, elderly woman who had run a small, quiet family restaurant just 6 blocks away from the police station for more than 30 years. Evelyn had signed that paper at her own kitchen table just the night before. Her hands had been shaking so violently from stress and exhaustion that the final letter of her last name had come out crooked, looping awkwardly off the line. After signing it, she had actually looked up and apologized to Adrian for her messy handwriting, as if her shaky hands were the problem, and not the nightmare she was living through. Her complaint wasn't about a stolen car or a broken window. It was about something much darker. A private security firm calling itself Civic Shield had muscled its way into her life. 2 men in matching dark jackets had walked into her empty dining room on a slow Tuesday afternoon, looked around at the aging decor, and calmly explained that the neighborhood was changing. They told her that city police response times were becoming unreliable, and that for a yearly fee of $12,000, she could purchase what they politely termed a security consulting agreement to guarantee her safety. When Evelyn asked what exactly she would be paying for, they smiled, left a business card right on her cash register, and walked out. She said no. And that refusal started a slow, calculated destruction of her life. Within 2 weeks, her restaurant's business license, which had been renewed without issue for decades, was suddenly flagged for urgent verification 3 separate times in 5 weeks. A fire inspection that wasn't scheduled until the following spring was suddenly moved forward without explanation. And a harsh inspector arrived on a Friday night right in the middle of dinner service, standing in her narrow kitchen for an hour, while 40 customer orders went completely cold. Her regular produce deliveries started arriving late, then damaged, then demanding a signature from a manager who was never on site. Every single time Evelyn tried to call the police for help, Her call was logged, coded, and quietly dropped to the absolute bottom of the department's priority list. Not refused, never formally refused, just never reached. She had come to believe that Civic Shield had someone high up inside the city government protecting them. She had no proof, just a stack of damaged receipts, a folder of hostile inspection notices, a business card on her register, and the terrifying memory of two men telling her the neighborhood was changing. Adrian had agreed to carry her complaint into the heart of the North River District himself. He didn't tell a single soul in that building who he actually was. Behind the high laminate counter that morning sat Sergeant Brent Keller. Keller was in his mid-40s, thick through the shoulders and neck, moving with the heavy, unearned confidence of a man who had worked the exact same desk long enough to believe he owned the building. He took Adrian's document case without looking up, slid the single sheet of paper out, and started reading. Somewhere around the fourth line, his eyes stopped moving. "This is just a business dispute," Keller said flatly, not even bothering to look Adrian in the eye. He dropped the paper back onto the counter as if it were trash. "She got a sales pitch she didn't like. People come in here every day whining about sales calls. That's not a crime." Adrian didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand on the desk. He simply looked down at the paper, then back up at the sergeant. "I'm asking you to enter this complaint into the official intake system," Adrian said calmly, his voice steady and low. "So it receives an official file number. That is all she asked for." Keller let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He shook his head, leaning over the counter. "The intake system is for actual police reports, mister. I am not going to clog up our database with a woman's bad attitude over a sales call. If Evelyn Shaw feels so strongly about it, tell her to hire an attorney." The lobby went quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent light above. "Does the refusal get logged?" Adrian asked. Keller froze. He looked up, locking eyes with Adrian for the first time. It was a completely ordinary question, asked in a completely ordinary tone. But it landed on the sergeant like a physical blow, like an accusation he hadn't prepared to block. "That's not how it works," Keller snapped, his face tightening. Instead of backing down, Adrian leaned slightly closer. "Who has access to the intake system terminal right now? Is that access tied to individual credentials or to a shared shift login? And where is the supervisor's formal sign-off for a refused complaint recorded in your manual?" 3 questions. No shouting, no anger. Keller's initial discomfort instantly morphed into cold hostility, because these weren't the confused, frustrated questions of an ordinary, helpless citizen. These were the exact, surgical questions of someone who already knew how the system worked from the inside out, someone who knew every loophole, every protocol, and every violation. Standing just 8 feet away at a second terminal was Officer Allison Crane. She was younger, cautious, and sharp, the kind of officer who had learned early in her career that the safest place in any corrupt room was slightly behind someone else's shadow. "Crane," Keller barked, never breaking eye contact with Adrian. "Kill the camera." Crane didn't move immediately. Her eyes flicked up to the small security and counter-monitoring unit mounted directly above them, then to Adrian, and then back to Keller. She weighed the order in her head for 4 long seconds, 4 seconds, that would later be replayed frame by frame in front of a state prosecutor. Then, slowly, she reached beneath the wooden desk, felt for the switch, and cut the feed. The small red light above the lens went instantly dark. Keller didn't hesitate. He pushed the complaint across the laminate toward her. "Tear it." Crane took the page. She folded it once, right down the middle, and pulled. The sharp, tearing sound of paper ripping apart echoed loudly through the quiet lobby, louder than the hum of the vending machines, louder than the distant radio. Keller snatched both halves out of her trembling hands, folded them again, and kept tearing until the paper was reduced to a dozen ragged, useless pieces. Some he threw carelessly back onto the counter, the rest he shoved down into the open metal trash can sitting right beside his knee. Adrian watched every single movement. He didn't lunge forward. He didn't try to grab the paper. His hands stayed precisely where they had been, folded calmly on the edge of the counter, while he counted the seconds silently in his head. 1, 2, 3. He knew he would soon have to reconstruct every single second of this horrific display entirely from memory. Keller unclipped a heavy pair of standard-issue handcuffs from his duty belt. With a deliberate, threatening motion, he laid them flat on the desk between them, metal clicking against laminate, laying down the universal symbol of intimidation that he was certain would end the conversation for good. "If you keep making trouble in this lobby," Keller said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous threat, "I'm going to have you physically removed from this building. And trust me, that removal can happen a few different ways, depending on how cooperative you decide to be right now." Adrian looked down at the cold steel of the handcuffs, and then slowly raised his eyes back to the sergeant's face. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, terrifying certainty. "Make sure," Adrian said softly, "you don't regret what you did today." Lieutenant Nolan Briggs stepped out from the narrow back hallway because he had heard voices, and Briggs despised voices in his lobby. To him, the front desk was a machine that was supposed to run smoothly, quietly, and without a single ripple of friction. Briggs was leaner than Keller, sharper, and far better groomed. He carried himself with the posture of a man who had already been promoted twice inside his own head, wearing a crisp uniform that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust or a drop of rain. He took in the entire scene in one fast, sweeping glance, the jagged pieces of torn paper scattered across the counter, the dark, unlit camera light above, and an ordinary civilian standing with terrifying stillness in front of his desk. He didn't ask why the paper was destroyed. He didn't ask who had given the order to cut the security feed. He simply walked up, stared down Adrian, and demanded to know what the problem was. And before Adrian could even open his mouth to finish an answer, Briggs cut him off, declaring that his officers had already made their determination, and that the determination stood. Final. End of discussion. Adrian waited. He let Briggs finish every single arrogant word, letting the lieutenant dig his own grave just a fraction deeper. Then, Adrian said something that had nothing to do with Evelyn Shaw at all. "I understand Northbridge is still an open question here." There was no Northbridge. The word didn't exist. Adrian had literally invented it out of thin air on his drive over to the station, dropping a fake seed into the dirt just to see what kind of worm would crawl out. It wasn't a case. It wasn't a company. It wasn't a street name. It meant absolute zero. Yet, the second the word left Adrian's lips, Briggs' chin jerked up half an inch. "Who told you about Northbridge?" The question came out of Briggs's mouth before he could even process it. The moment he heard himself say it, his jaw locked tight. He tried to swallow it back, stumbling over his words to cover the slip, claiming the conversation was finished and that the district had real work to do. But the damage was already done. The words were floating in the air, impossible to pull back. To Adrian, that single panicked reaction told him more than the entire folder clutched in his hand. A sergeant tearing up a complaint was ugly. It was outright misconduct that could get a man suspended for 30 days. But a lieutenant hearing a completely fabricated, meaningless code name and immediately assuming it was a real top secret operation he hadn't been briefed on, that was something entirely different. A man only fears a code name he hasn't heard yet if he already believes there is something dirty enough to warrant one. Whatever was rotting inside North River Police District, it went far deeper than a lazy front desk. Briggs, desperate to wipe the slate clean, ordered him thrown out of the building. A young officer named Evan Ross was assigned to walk him to the doors. Evan couldn't have been more than 3 years on the job. He had watched the entire confrontation unfold from near the file cabinets, standing completely silent, and that silence was already eating him alive. As they walked across the lobby, Evan kept his eyes locked on the floor, refusing to look Adrian in the eye. At the heavy glass doors, Adrian stopped, turned his head back toward the dark lens of the security camera above the counter, and spoke softly. "Remember the exact moment you decided to stay quiet," Adrian said, his voice cutting through the quiet room. "You'll come back to it." Evan held the door open, his jaw tight, offering no answer at all. Adrian stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, crossed the street, and sat down on a cold stone bench facing the front entrance of the district. He pulled out his phone. There was nothing glowing on the screen except a digital countdown timer already running, 45 minutes. That was the exact time limit Chief Daniel Mercer had given him. Across the city, the chief of police was currently cutting through traffic alongside an internal affairs strike team, a deputy from the state prosecutor's office, and 2 high-level digital forensic specialists. Adrian could have walked right back inside that building at any second and ended the charade early. But he chose to wait. He understood the math of human corruption. Tearing up a single complaint was a bad morning, a lapse in judgment that a slick defense attorney could spin as a momentary loss of temper to a sympathetic jury. But spending 3/4 of an hour coordinating the systematic erasure of every digital and physical trace of that morning, that required planning, and planning required knowing with absolute certainty that you had committed a crime. So he laid his phone face up on the bench beside him and let them build the airtight case for him. Inside the district, the atmosphere curdled fast, panic moved like poison. Keller spent the next 20 minutes pacing behind the counter, telling anyone who would listen that the guy had been baiting him, that it was a garbage complaint, that people came in every day trying to start a fight. He said it so many times with such desperate repetition that it stopped sounding like an excuse and started sounding like a confession. Briggs moved with a much colder, deadlier purpose. He ordered Keller to scour every inch of the counter and the trash can to gather every single atom of the torn paper, making sure not a single fiber remained in the building. He turned to Officer Crane and told her to pull the camera storage files from the morning block and clear the temporary right cache. When Crane hesitated, paralyzed by the sudden weight of what she was being asked to do, Briggs smiled coldly and explained that a routine system audit was coming up and that partial recordings only created confusion. Crane swallowed hard, placed her trembling hands back on the keyboard, and hit execute. Yet, human error always leaves a trail. On the far side of the room, young Officer Evan Ross saw something glinting near the base of a plastic chair. A tiny, white triangle of paper, barely 2 inches across, had drifted away from the trash can. It carried a fragment of a printed line and the jagged tail end of Evelyn Shaw's signature in blue ink. Evan didn't hand it to Keller. His heart hammering against his ribs, he folded the scrap twice and slipped it straight into his shirt pocket. It wasn't part of a grand master plan. It was simply the panicked reflex of a young man who had already made one cowardly decision that morning and knew he wouldn't survive a second. Outside on the stone bench, the countdown hit 0. Adrian stood up, slipped his phone into his jacket pocket, and walked back across the street. The heavy glass doors swung open, and Keller saw him coming. The sergeant practically bolted out from behind the counter, his face twisted in absolute disbelief. "You still don't understand, do you?" Keller snarled, pointing a thick finger. "You are not welcome here. Get out." Adrian didn't even blink, because right behind him a calm, commanding voice echoed through the lobby. "Maybe you should understand who you just threw out." Chief Daniel Mercer stepped through the doors. He wasn't wearing his usual daily uniform. He was dressed in full, immaculate dress uniform, something nobody at North River had ever seen him wear on a random Tuesday morning. Right behind him marched 4 members of the Internal Affairs Division, the deputy prosecutor carrying a heavy, sealed leather folder, and 2 forensic technicians wheeling high-tech equipment cases across the tiled floor. Chief Mercer didn't yell. He didn't need to. He walked with absolute, measured steps to the exact center of the lobby, his eyes locking onto the 3 things that mattered: the dark camera housing with its dead red light, the tiny specks of white paper still clinging to the edge of the laminate desk, and the cold steel handcuffs sitting right where Keller had dropped them. He took his time looking at each one. Then he turned to face the entire room. All North River personnel. On your feet. Right now. Plastic chairs scraped violently against the floor. Conversations died mid-sentence. Officers popped their heads out of side offices, freezing instantly in the doorways when they saw who was standing in the middle of the floor. Chief Mercer raised his voice, clear and unyielding. He told the room that the man they had spent the entire morning mocking, dismissing, and threatening was Adrian Carter, newly appointed Deputy Director of the Office of Independent Professional Standards and Public Integrity. He explained that Adrian had been deployed into their district with zero warning, zero announcement, and no safety net for the express purpose of evaluating how North River handled public complaints. And every single action that had taken place in that lobby since 9 o'clock that morning was now being legally documented, imaged, and locked into the permanent record, whether the people responsible cooperated or not. Keller's face cycled through a dozen different shades of pale, white, and sickly green, finally settling on absolute terror. Mercer took a breath, his eyes sweeping across the frozen room, and delivered 3 words that changed the atmosphere completely. Render honors. Personnel, up. It moved through the room like a tidal wave. Dozens of hands shot up to caps and brows all at once in a formal salute, in a room where, less than an hour ago, a man in a worn-out gray jacket had been told he was a nobody who didn't belong. Every single officer was now standing at rigid attention. Officer Crane's hand was shaking so violently she could barely keep it level. Evan's hand was steady, his expression carved out of stone. Sergeant Keller was the absolute last to move, his arm rising slowly, agonizingly, his physical body instinctively obeying a chain of command that his brain had entirely rejected. Adrian didn't smile. He didn't look at Keller with petty triumph. He looked across the room at every single raised hand, and what showed in his eyes was something much heavier, profound disappointment. Put your hands down, Adrian said quietly. The hands dropped, one by one, awkward and uncertain. My title is not the reason that complaint deserved to be accepted, Adrian said, his voice echoing off the walls. Evelyn Shaw earned that right with a single stroke of her pen on a kitchen table. Nothing else was ever required. If the only thing that makes this room stand up and pay attention is finding out that I outrank you, then not a single one of you has understood anything that happened here today. He turned his back on them, walking slowly toward the front counter. I want every single fragment of that paper recovered, photographed in place, and bagged. I want the camera storage server imaged, including every byte deleted in the last hour. And I want an honest answer from anyone in this building who wants to give it right now. Why were 2 officers confident enough to destroy a citizen's complaint in broad daylight, in the middle of a Tuesday, right in front of a stranger? No one answered. The silence was absolute. Mercer gave a single nod to the internal affairs team, and the machinery of True. Unyielding justice finally began to turn. Thank you so much for watching today's story. If this video touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Solo Dad Stories for more touching tales about family, dignity, and second chances. Let us know in the comments below which moment stayed with you the most. We'll see you in the next video. Take care.